What's good, fam?
So there's this critique of Joseph Campbell going around these days. It's becoming very cool to not like Joseph Campbell. But it's not. It's very cool to like Joseph Campbell, and I'm here to tell you why. So for some people, it's enough that someone like Jordan Peterson is into Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung to just dismiss that entire train of thought. Other people try to engage with his ideas a little bit in order to make their critique, like this one article that was published in the LA Review of Books. So I'm going to be engaging directly with this article and showing why pretty much every point they make is wrong. So the first critique of Joseph Campbell that I see around these days is that he produces generic writing. Now, the article I just mentioned doesn't go deep into this point, but they do hint at it when they say that he gives prescriptive writing advice. Now, here's the thing. Joseph Campbell didn't do that. He never did that. The Hero with 1,000 Faces, a book written in 1949, came well before this sort of pop guru era we're in where everyone writes a book about writing. Joseph Campbell was not giving writing advice. Sure, writers have found inspiration there, but that's not what The Hero with 1,000 Faces is about. The second critique of Joseph Campbell that I see often is that he imposes his structure and his idea of the monomyth upon the myths of world cultures. This one is extremely easy to argue against because it's just simply not true. If you spend any time with The Hero with 1,000 Faces, it's very obvious that Joseph Campbell is developing his theory from close readings of myths from world culture. He's not coming up with the structure first and then imposing it upon all these myths and saying, see, it lines up, my theory's correct. That's not what he's doing. He reads a myth and goes, I've seen this trope somewhere else before. There's a symbol here that's recurring. Let's think about what that means and how that could fit into a bigger picture. His theory emerges out of the myths. He's not imposing anything upon these myths. Yet, despite that, the authors of this article claim that Campbell plucked what was useful and then fit the elements into a prefabricated frame without giving the elements proper consideration. Claiming that Joseph Campbell ignores the context of these myths he's talking about, or that he reduces them to their archetypes, is an incredibly silly critique, because that's the point. That was his entire project, was to find points of similarity in the myths around the world and think about what these symbols might represent, what part of the collective unconscious, what archetypes they may be giving expression to. The third critique I often see is that Joseph Campbell cherry picks his evidence. In other words, that he's picking myths that reinforce his theory of the monomyth. The authors of this article use the phrase, the fallacy of incomplete evidence, but I'm serious now, this is not a rhetorical question. Tell me, what would it look like to not do this? What would that look like? The object of his study is all myths ever from all cultures ever. What do you want him to do? Talk about every single story ever told? What would that even look like? That's an absurd thing to ask for. Of course he has to cherry pick his evidence. That's what everyone does when you make an argument, or when you tell a story for that matter. You have to de-emphasize certain details and emphasize other details in order to find a path through it all, in order to organize it into a narrative. That's what an argument is. Okay, the fourth critique I often see of Joseph Campbell is that Joseph Campbell is a purveyor of some sort of heroic individualism. So the authors of this article write that Campbell is comparable to the ethical egoism of someone like Ayn Rand. They also claim that Campbell, quote, sold the public on a vision of the individual hero unfettered from community or history, which is supposedly playing into America's unique brand of rugged individualism. The problem with this argument is this is the exact opposite of what Joseph Campbell's doing. Anyone who has spent any time with the hero's journey knows that once you get past this sort of normal world, the call to adventure, the entry into the special world, this sort of basic stuff, you find out that the whole point of the hero's journey is not just the apotheosis of the individual, but it's something called elixir theft. What's the elixir theft? You go into the special world, which is symbolically the subconscious, in order to find something of value to bring back to your community. In fact, the hero only goes on his journey in the first place because there's something wrong with the community. In this sense, the hero is the shaman, the hero is the healer, and the elixir is the medicine. The whole point of the hero's journey is to bridge the individual with the collective. So the authors of this article write, quote, "The use of the monomyth is in a way nearly perfectly narcissistic. It invites audiences to focus on just one character, to see the world as serving the interest of one singular point of view." But this is not a critique of Campbell. That's a critique of storytelling as such. I'm sorry, that's what stories do. They have a protagonist. Sure, maybe there's some stories that play with that a little bit and have multiple protagonists, and that's cool. Who's not into that? But to blame Campbell for stories having a singular point of view, excuse me? That doesn't make any sense. Have you read a story before? Campbell, by the way, spends so much of his time elucidating the archetypes other than the hero. So much time is spent on the goddess and on the mentor and on the ally and on the trickster and all these other things that make the weave of character that is the hero's journey. It's really not just about the hero. Try reading the book. In case you're new to the wonderful world of storytelling, most stories have a single protagonist. They also have other characters, but they have a single protagonist. And they reveal the world through their perspective. And unless you're willing to reject nearly all stories ever written, then you shouldn't have a problem with this. Critique number 5 of Joseph Campbell that I see is that Joseph Campbell is somehow dangerous. Dangerous? Like, what kind of danger are we talking about here? Obviously, it's like his ideas are dangerous, but how? I've never understood this. So the authors of the article give a number of examples. Here's the first one they give. Campbell's hero brings dangers to those who put their faith in it. Their first danger is a serious misunderstanding of how myths work, which makes me think they're about to tell us how myths work, but this is all they have to say about it, is that myths function in specific environments for reasons bounded by time and place. Which is why Joseph Campbell's project is interesting in the first place, because yes, that's how myths function. So let's think about them outside of their specific time and place for a change, and see the similarities between myths and extract from that some universal symbolism and archetypes. That's how we go below the surface. What's dangerous about that? Doesn't make any sense to me. If it makes sense to you, let me know in the comments below, please. The second danger, I'm quoting now, the second danger is the existence of an ideal form in myth. Calling one version of a story a variant implies, wrongly, that there is an authoritative and original form. Now, this is a really slippery argument, because if you value Campbell's idea at all, then all myths are variants. There is no ideal form. The ideal form lies beyond language and imagery to capture. It's the archetypes of the subconscious. The myth is a variant of that. It clothes it in signifiers that make sense to a particular culture at a particular time. Show me where in Campbell he claims there is one ideal myth and the others are variants of it. Okay, the third danger that these authors find is that of hero worship. So they claim that Campbell presents all heroes as inherently good, as sort of like role models that people should look up to or respect, while they claim that, historically most myths, heroes have been pretty morally gray, or at sometimes pretty terrible. They do terrible things either on purpose or by accident. Okay, here's the thing. This is a critique of Disney, not of Campbell. I don't know where in Campbell you're reading that he says all heroes are good or have to be good. Campbell's the first to recognize that heroes can be monsters. Campbell doesn't pass judgment on the heroes, moral judgment, good or bad. In fact, he emphasizes the mystical or the aesthetic mindset that rises above such judgments and can perceive, the word aesthetic comes from perceive, to perceive these characters in a way beyond our earthly judgments. Following James Joyce, he argues against the kinetic conception of art, kinetic meaning to move, which believes that art is meant to move people towards judgment, good or bad, or to go out and protest or vote for one party or another party. That's the kinetic concept of art. And Joseph Campbell does not believe that that's proper art. He believes in the aesthetic concept of art, which means art's purpose is to help us perceive things from an elevated perspective. And the other thing is that Joseph Campbell is not the first person to make this argument, nor was James Joyce, nor was Nietzsche when he wrote The Birth of Tragedy. This argument goes all the way back to the Greeks, who wrote tragedies about characters who we're not supposed to sit there in judgment of them. Oh, what a bad person. I'm glad these terrible things are happening to them. We're supposed to see through that to something more universal and human. The authors also go down this argument, which I hate to follow them down, but they make a case that Campbell's followers in pop culture are very toxic and very sort of like masculinist and very white and all of this. And just right off the bat, this is such a bad faith argument because Joseph Campbell had nothing to do with those people. He's been dead for decades. It's so unfair to bring up someone like Jordan Peterson into an argument about Joseph Campbell as if Joseph Campbell would love Jordan Peterson or agree with him. We don't know that. We have no idea. Moreover, this argument is not even about Joseph Campbell's personal politics, as murky as they might be. It's about his work as a writer and about what sorts of arguments he makes. And what kind of argument did Campbell make? He made the argument that there's two types of myths, one that reinforce existing power in the tribal or racial center, versus types of myths that get us beyond the bounds of our tribal or racial identity and identify more with humanity at large, or even beyond that, with the universe and life as such. Campbell valued that second type of myth against the first type. The writing of Buffy the Vampire Slayer does not reflect upon the values of the ideas of Joseph Campbell any more than a mass shooter going to a Batman screening reflects upon the value of Christopher Nolan as a director. It's just a bad argument. But the authors go a step further here. They argue that the structure of the hero's journey is itself somehow essentially masculine. This one is hard to dismiss so easily. There actually may be some truth to this. It's worth thinking about whether things that are not human beings can be gendered masculine or feminine. I mean, the jury's out on that. I don't know. I don't want to get into that debate. But maybe there is some truth to that. Maybe the hero's journey, the idea of this individual who is leaving bravely the normal world to go venture into the dark forest of the subconscious, maybe there is a penetrative act in that motion. Maybe there is something essentially masculine to that. However, again, this is a critique of storytelling. That's a critique of the myths that Joseph Campbell's drawing from, not Joseph Campbell's conclusions. What these writers are actually saying is that storytelling as such is essentially masculine, which, if you believe that, that's on you to figure out. There might also be something inherently masculine about publishing essays in the LA Review of Books. It's really hard to imagine what these authors even mean when they write things like, quote, "The monomyth sets up unrealistic expectations. It harms people who don't see themselves represented, and it traps people in roles based on the bodies they inhabit or skin color, race, sex, gender, and ability." What does any of that have to do with Campbell? I do not understand the train of thought here. Ironically, their decision to direct this harm at Campbell himself rather than at myth-making as such and at the stories that Campbell's drawing from betrays their own anger at human culture, at the history of human culture from everywhere around the world, rather than one guy who wrote a book in 1949. Joseph Campbell is extracting themes and motifs from stories around the world. The stories are about particular characters who have a particular race and a particular gender. What Campbell's doing is extracting from that specificity something more universal. So blaming Campbell for stories not representing certain people makes less than no sense. Just go read the book. Just read the book. Okay, critique number 6 I often see of Joseph Campbell is not really a critique. It's just something in this article that I wanted to point out, which is they claim there are challenges to Campbell that are arising now at this moment in our culture. The idea that Dune or the Wheel of Time or the MCU are somehow bravely post-Campbellian and are like questioning what it means to be a hero, rather than just being perfect examples of exactly what Joseph Campbell was talking about, is laughable at best. The idea that we're currently going through some sort of reflective turn where writers are starting to question what it means to be a hero is hilarious historical revisionism. Campbell himself represents the reflective turn. Before Campbell and the writers who came just before him, we didn't have the gift of consciousness. We were working intuitively. The reflective turn comes from Campbell. In their conclusion, these authors suggest that Campbell's monomyth is somehow not available to all. It's not clear what they mean by this. Campbell clearly believes it is available to all. That's why he calls it the monomyth. It's this one universal story that we've been telling over and over in all cultures, in all times. It's the story of life. It's about the passage from birth to death and what lies beyond. It is the only truly universal thing we have. Campbell's only agenda was to look at world mythology to see the recurring themes. And I say themes, not just structures, but themes, ideas, motifs, in order to show that we're all telling the same story, the story of life. To claim that Joseph Campbell believes that this universal story only belongs to one people is either to misunderstand him or to represent his arguments in bad faith. So which is it? The seventh critique I often see of Joseph Campbell, it's not actually from this article, it's just from some comments I've seen from strangers on the internet, but I think it's worth delving into anyway. It's the argument that meaningful stories are themselves dangerous. What? This argument blew my mind when I first encountered it because, to me, meaningful stories are the most important thing in the world, and we need more of them.
Meaning is the most important thing in our lives?
Certainly, because what I call a will to meaning, the wish to find and to fulfill meaning, is the basic motivation in human beings.
But some people think that is itself the danger. That's what makes Campbell dangerous. The argument, I think, goes something like this, that having a population who truly believe in their own mythology, who truly believe in their own beliefs, is dangerous because it breeds fundamentalism, that people get blinded and will do crazy things like hijack airplanes or do a school shooting. William Butler Yeats put this in a very beautiful way in one of his poems. He writes, "The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." This couldn't be more wrong. This is the exact opposite of the truth. The problem we face today is not that we believe too strongly in our mythology. It's the exact opposite. We don't have a mythology that unites us. The people who hijack airplanes or do school shootings are not suffering from an overabundance of belief in their mythology, just the opposite. They have self-consciousness, they have doubt, they have to prove it to themselves. That's why they do such crazy acts. The people who hijack airplanes or who do school shootings are suffering from a fatal lack of meaning in their lives. To quote Slavoj Žižek on this matter, after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in France, Žižek had this to say. What they being Muslim terrorists, what they obviously lack is a feature that is easy to discern in all authentic fundamentalists, from Tibetan Buddhists to Amish in the US, the absence of resentment and envy, the deep indifference towards the non-believer's way of life. If today's so-called fundamentalists really believe they have found their way to truth, why should they feel threatened by non-believers? Why should they envy them? When a Buddhist encounters a Western hedonist, he hardly condemns. He just benevolently notes that the hedonist's search for happiness is self-defeating. In contrast to true fundamentalists, the terrorist pseudo-fundamentalists are deeply bothered, intrigued, fascinated by the sinful life of the non-believer. So what he's saying here is that the real dangerous one is not the fundamentalist who truly believes in his mythology. It's the pseudo-fundamentalist who is on shaky ground, who does not fully believe in his mythology. Ever since religion has ceased being this story that everyone within a society believes in, and what unifies that society, we've been looking for something to replace it with. Some people find that in the blood sport of politics, as Camille Paglia puts it. But that's extremely dangerous. That's the dangerous thing, is this secular religion called politics. What isn't dangerous is storytelling. In that sense, Joseph Campbell is not dangerous. Joseph Campbell is our knight in shining armor. Joseph Campbell is our hero. Thanks for listening to my video. Whatever you do, do not subscribe. Do not like this video.